Hi, everyone. Welcome to another PCC Writing Support Center workshop. My name is Giselle, and today's workshop is titled Writing Research Papers. And as the name suggests, we will be talking about the different steps in writing a research paper, and you will walk away with this workshop with some usable material for your research paper. So before we get into the content of this workshop, I did want to give you some advice as to how you can get the most out of this workshop. If you've taken a Writing Support Center workshop before, and if you've taken one of my workshops, you know that I always do this in the beginning as a way to ensure that you're getting the most out of the workshop. So the first thing I'd like you to do is download the processing worksheet if you haven't already. Wherever you access this workshop, there should be a worksheet available for download in both PDF and Word document format. So please download just one version and choose a version that works best for you. So if you prefer fillable PDF, go ahead and download that. If you'd rather do it in Microsoft Word, please download that. Using the processing worksheet will help you understand the information a bit deeper as you go through this workshop. And like I said in the beginning, it'll also give you something that you can use for your research paper after this workshop. You also want to take your time. Since this is a recorded workshop, you can pause whenever you need, and you can also rewind. If there's a point that I mentioned that doesn't seem too clear, you can rewind and rewatch as needed. But the benefit of this being recorded is that you can take your time and do the workshop at your own pace. So, for our workshop goals today, the first thing is that I want you all to be able to identify what a research paper is and what it isn't. It is different from other types of writing. While it does have elements of other writing you might have done already, it's important to understand what makes a research paper different from the others. We're also going to review the different steps of writing a research paper, and I'm going to be breaking down those steps so that you can understand them a little bit more. You're also going to choose a topic for an upcoming research paper. This workshop is best suited for those of you who are already writing a research paper for a class. If you're not writing a research paper for a class, this might not be as useful for you. I would suggest doing another workshop that might prove more useful, but it will be useful for those of you who are currently writing a research paper. You're also going to practice writing a properly formatted citation for a works cited or references page, depending on what format you're using, either MLA or APA. If you're in an English composition course, you're most likely going to be using MLA. The citation is going to be for a works cited page, and that will come at the end, and you will be able to use it and add it to your works cited page. So, to begin, what is a research paper? Purdue Owl, for those of you who don't know, is a very popular website. It's from Purdue University and it's their writing center. And it's popular because it has very in depth guides for writing papers, in depth guides for MLA format, APA format. I will be providing that link later, but this information is from that website. So, according to Purdue Owl, a research paper is first the culmination and final product of an involved process of research, critical thinking, source evaluation, organization, and composition. So, in your class, in your composition class, you might have already done writing that does require research, that does require critical thinking, source evaluation, organization, and composition. But what makes a research paper different is the volume of research that you're doing. Typically, with a research paper, you're going to have anywhere from 3 to 8 sources, depending on your instructor. And you're going to be looking at those sources and evaluating the argument in those sources, but also understanding how another person's argument informs your own opinion. That's what it means by source evaluation. So as you read through these sources, It's helping you to understand what you want to argue in your own paper. Again, you're looking at multiple sources, so you're seeing how these articles are in conversation with one another. You're critically thinking about that conversation and coming up with your own interpretation of the topic, whatever your research topic is. Um, it's also longer than your typical essay. Depending on your instructor, it can be anywhere from 7 to 15 pages. So, research paper is lengthy because you are engaging with outside research, analyzing that research, and using it to inform your own opinion on a topic. Purdue Owl also states that research papers are a living thing, which grows and changes as a student explores, interprets, and evaluates sources related to a specific topic. So, what that means is you might enter research paper writing with a topic in mind. You might not have a solid argument quite yet, or maybe you already do. But it's important to understand that your opinion of that topic might change as you do more research. Again, with any topic, there's going to be a lot of different voices, which means a lot of different opinions. So, as you read through different articles, your opinion might evolve as you read through these articles. So it's important to understand that and know that it's okay for your opinion to change as you do more research. A research paper is also supported by research, as the name suggests. Primary and secondary sources are the heart of a research paper and provide its nourishment. Without the support of and interaction with these sources, the research paper would morph into a different genre of writing, like an encyclopedic article. So it's really important to understand that what makes a research paper is the research. You're getting you might be looking at a primary source. So what that means is if your research paper is about a book that you've been assigned, you then have to find secondary sources, so other experts in the field talking about that book or different themes in the book. But you need those secondary sources for you to develop your own argument. And it's also really important that you provide your opinion. So you're not taking these secondary sources and summarizing them for your reader. You're not doing that. You're using opinions from other articles and other authors in order to shape your own argument, in order for you to be in conversation with those as well. If you don't provide your own opinion, if you don't analyze the articles, if you don't critically think about what you're putting into your paper, it then just turns into summary or something like an encyclopedic article, as the quote says. So that's what makes research papers different, is that they're not merely summarizing all the research you're finding, you're using that research to create your own opinion on the topic. So that's very important to know about a research paper. So what a research paper is it's not an informed summary, like I was just saying. Secondary sources should support your argument, which means you should analyze how they contribute to your argument rather than summarize their content. You want to avoid summary, and you want to make sure you're conversing with the articles you're citing, not simply summarizing what the author is saying or repeating what the author is saying. Your research paper is also not simply an opinion piece. While your analysis should guide the paper, you should avoid providing opinions unsupported by evidence. So that means you want to avoid making value statements. Like if you cite an author and then you say, I think this author's argument is very strong, you're not providing your opinion on what you think about the author's argument. You're instead analyzing that argument and stating how it relates to your own opinion of the argument. For example, is the author you're citing, are they saying something opposite of you? Is it your counter argument? Are they making a point that you're drawing from? So is there something about their point that you are expanding upon? Are you using their argument as merely a starting point so that you can explain more about what you might think on that topic? So it's really important that whatever you state in your essay, you're backing it up with research. The ultimate goal of a research paper. So, what you really want to do with a research paper is, instead of simply informing your readers of what others have said about a topic, you should draw on what has been said by others in order to craft your own unique perspective on an issue. So, ultimately, a research paper is you conversing with all of these different authors in these different articles, and providing your own opinion. You're essentially contributing to the conversation with your own unique opinion. So, here is a simplified version of steps for writing a research paper. I think for many people, it's easier to see a big procedure like writing a research paper broken down into various steps. So, this is very simplified. Um, each person will have their own way of writing a research paper. They might not do it in this exact order, but if you're new to writing a research paper, having this process broken up into these 5 different steps might be helpful for you. Again, I'm going to be going into more detail with each of these steps as we go on. But the 5 steps that I've identified are: choosing a topic, first and foremost; second, doing the research; third, planning and outlining; fourth, writing and revising; and then finally, documenting your sources. So to begin, we're going to review steps 1 and 2. And to do that, we're going to view a video from our very own PCC Shatford library. And in this video, the librarian is going to tell us how to choose a topic and do library research. So give me just 1 second. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and put this full screen.
Hi, I'm Catherine, one of the PCC librarians. Today I'll be teaching you about research topic and keyword brainstorming. In this tutorial, you'll learn to generate research questions related to a topic. You'll pick out the key terms or phrases from one of the research questions, and then build a set of related words and synonyms for each of the keywords. These keywords should come in handy when you start searching for information on your topic, especially in the library databases. This is a great exercise to complete when you're getting started on a research paper or project. I'm using a worksheet to structure my brainstorming, but you can use a sheet of scratch paper, a Word document, or a Google Doc just as easily. The first thing I'll need to do is to choose a topic that interests me. You'll be spending a considerable amount of time developing your expertise on this topic, so be sure to select something you're genuinely curious about. For my example topic, I'm going to use online education, something I've been thinking a lot about in recent weeks. This is a broad topic. I'll need to refine it a bit and decide what aspects of online education I want to investigate. It's helpful to develop open-ended questions that reflect more specifically what sparks your interest about a topic. Here are a few examples. What challenges do students face when attending college online? What are the most effective teaching techniques for online courses? How can professors build supportive class environments online? Now I'm going to choose one of these questions as my initial research inquiry. I'll focus on the first question. What challenges do students face when learning online? What are the main concepts, terms, or phrases in this question? These are what we refer to as keywords. I've identified 3 keywords or phrases: challenges, students, and learning online. In your research question, you may have more or fewer than 3 keywords, and that's fine too. Next, I'm going to move my keywords down to step 2 on my worksheet. Now that I've identified the keywords in my research question, I'm going to build a set of related terms for each of them. These could be synonyms, broader terms, narrower terms, or really anything that comes to mind as you consider each keyword. For challenges, I thought of a few synonyms: barriers, hurdles, and difficulties. For students, I brainstormed some more specific populations of students. I could narrow my focus to college students or students with disabilities, for example. Considering the impact of a topic on a specific population is often a helpful way to make a broad topic more manageable. For learning online, I came up with a variety of related terms, such as remote learning and distance education. Okay, now I have a nice set of keywords related to my research question. How can I put them to use? Well, this will become clear as you begin searching for information on your topic. It's especially helpful to have a list of keywords to choose from when you search in library databases such as EBSCOhost Combined. This is the search page for EBSCOhost Combined. You'll notice that it has 3 different search fields. This is where I can begin to utilize my keywords, plugging one into each of the fields. Here I chose challenges, students with disabilities, and online classes as my search terms. Since I have a set of keywords to choose from, if my first search doesn't generate the kind of results I'm hoping for, I can refer to my list and try out different terms. During every step in the research process, PCC librarians are here to help. Just visit pasadena.edu/library and click on Ask a Librarian to see all the different ways you can get one-on-one assistance with your research. Thanks! Hi, I'm Catherine.
All right, so in that video, it was a quick overview of how to perform research along with how to narrow down a topic. So, to highlight some of the key points from that video, I just want to tell you so, when choosing a topic, you can choose a general topic. So, in this case, the librarian Catherine, she chose online education. She then narrowed it down by choosing 3 keywords, or first asking 3 questions that would help her get thinking about the research topic. These are typically called research questions. And they're really helpful in getting you to think about your topic. So, first, you should ask a few different questions. I would suggest 1 to 3 about your topic so it'll help you narrow down your focus. After you've picked those 3 questions, you're going to choose at least one of those questions and pick out 3 keywords to help you while you do your research. Once you've chosen a topic and figured out what aspects of the topic you'd like to highlight, you will then need to choose those search terms, which is why the questions are really helpful in identifying those keywords. You will then use those keywords you've identified in the PCC databases, just as shown in the video. I do want to show you what that video or what the PCC library website actually looks like. So if you do go to pasadena.edu library, it will take you directly to our campus's library page. And on that page, you're going to see something that you can just start your search there. But what I would recommend is to go to databases. And when you go to databases, you're going to be given a lot. I'm going to suggest that you do use EBSCO. That is the most general database that you can use. It can be used for all sorts of disciplines. So as you can see here, it's a wide variety of different of databases, a combined search of EBSCOhost databases, and it contains thousands of journals. So as you begin your research, it's best to just use this one to get you started. Some other ones I would recommend are JSTOR. So if you're writing an English paper, specifically if you're writing about literature, JSTOR is great in that. It's also good for humanities too. So if you're writing on a topic in the humanities, JSTOR is also a great database. But for this, I'm going to just use EBSCOhost. So once you get here, you will need to log in with your own PCC login. And you'll get the same page that the librarian had in the video. And that after you've identified your keywords, like I said, you will be able to look up what you need to for your paper. So in this case, I'm just going to use the same one. So challenges, students, and learning online. So if I was doing the same topic that the librarian was doing, I would do this. And you can use the quotation marks. It is helpful in narrowing down your research. So if you wanted to add quotation marks, you can do that as well. And then when you hit search, you will get all of the articles that mention these keywords. So it depends on how you want to approach the topic, but looking through the articles, it's really helpful to look at the titles. So barriers to learning online experience by students with a mental health disability. If that's how you want to look at that research topic through the lens of mental health, you can do that. Or if you wanted to look at that topic through the lens of race, you can do that. African American males learning online, promoting academic achievement in higher education. So it depends on how you want to go about the topic. You can also narrow it down even more. So if you wanted to just do college students, you can search for that and you will get an even smaller amount of articles coming up because it's super specific. If you wanted it to be more general, you could even get rid of one of your keywords. So challenges in college students, it gets rid of the online portion, the learning online. So that might be, if you want specifically about to learn more about students who learn online, you might want to keep that phrasing in there. You can also change what you're looking for. So if you want a full text article, you can do that. If your instructor asks for peer-reviewed articles, you can do that as well. Peer-reviewed articles are important to have because they are seen as more credible, and they're preferred for research papers because they tend to be written by experts in the field and then they're later reviewed by other experts in the field, which is why they're called peer reviewed. So if you wanted a peer reviewed article, you can do that by clicking here. If you want a more recent article, you can change the publication date. And if you're looking for a certain source type, so if you want academic journals, you can do that as well. So this is helpful for you to narrow down. Again, the PCC library has many databases, and I highly recommend starting with EBSCOhost if you're just trying to narrow down what you want to do. So with our, for our purposes, it since this is a shorter workshop and we're going to be covering a lot, if you do want to learn more about conducting research, we do have a workshop for that. So please check out the PCC Writing Support Center Canvas page if you want to learn more about how to conduct research. Lastly, once you've picked your articles, make sure to read them actively and take notes while you read them. You want to annotate the readings as you go through them to help you understand the information more deeply. Uh, and again, there are a ton of other resources on the website, the PCC library website, which I will show you at the end of this presentation. So moving on, you are going to actually practice what was just gone over in that video on your worksheet. So as said in the beginning, you should have downloaded the processing worksheet. And on that worksheet, you will see an activity titled Identifying Your Topic and Brainstorming Search Terms. This activity is meant to help you get thinking about what you want to write about, and it'll also help you narrow down how to search for that topic. So you are going to begin by choosing a topic that interests you or a research topic that was assigned to you by your instructor. Once you've chosen a general topic, you will then ask more specific questions to narrow down your research on the topic, just like what was done in the video. Finally, you will then brainstorm search terms that will help simplify your process when you begin your research. The worksheet looks very similar to the worksheet that the librarian was using in her video. So if you need more assistance on how to fill out the worksheet, just watch the video again. You're going to be filling it out in the same way. So go ahead and pause here and continue once you've completed that portion of the worksheet. Okay, so now that you have your topic chosen and you've narrowed down your topic by choosing search terms to help you research, you're now going to plan and outline. Um, so, with planning and outlining, you once you've chosen your topic and done some research, you also want to decide how to organize your paper. Planning your paper will help you stay on topic, and it'll help you present your ideas in a logical order. A simple way to organize your paper is with an outline. Outlines can be either formal or informal. Your instructor might also require that you write an outline as part of your assignment. So you might have already had to write an outline, so you might be familiar with this process already. There are a few ways you can outline, but a general outline format looks like the one here. So you would start with an introduction. Um, uh, with your introduction, and in that you would put your thesis statement or your research question. After that, you would have each following point be the topic sentence of your body paragraph, each of your body paragraphs. So depending on how many body paragraphs you have, it will range. You might have 2 to 6, 2 to 7. It all depends on how many body paragraphs you have, but you want a point for each of those body paragraphs. Um, you After you put the topic sentence, you then want to put the different details in your outline. So if you're writing about a certain source in that paragraph, if you're highlighting a certain article, you would put that as one of your details. Um, Essentially, anything that you're using to prove your argument would be the details you put there. You can add more details as needed. Finally, you would end with your conclusion, which would be um, uh, reminding your reader of what you were writing about in the introduction, and anything you want to leave your reader with to think about after you've concluded your essay. So that's a general outline. Again, you might have already had to turn one in as part of your assignment, but you can also just have an informal outline. So if you don't want to do an outline with this exact format, as long as you write down something that helps you guide your thinking, it will be much easier when you go to write your essay. I would suggest in your outlines, when you're talking about which articles. So maybe in one paragraph, you're talking about one article you found, the second one, you're talking about a different article. But it will be easier for you when you do come to write your essay if you have a clear outline for how you'd like to write it and in what order. We do have an outlining workshop available as well. So if you want to know more about the outlining process, please go ahead and watch that. Again, I don't want to spend too much time on how to outline since we are covering a lot in this workshop. So with step 4, that is when you begin to write and revise. And there's a strong emphasis on the revise because I feel like sometimes as writers, we just want to get our thoughts down and get the paper done. But revision is such an important part of the writing process. Uh, Writing is a multi-step process. So because the research paper is on an in-depth analysis of a topic, it's especially important that you plan to have multiple drafts. I would suggest at least 2, but 3 is great. Uh, you also want to just begin by getting your ideas down in a rough draft. So the hardest part of writing a research paper is just getting those first words down on the page. Uh, But just begin by getting those ideas written on the page. You can focus on what you are drawn to writing about the most. You don't necessarily have to write in chronological order. So that means you don't need to start with your introduction. For example, if you found a source you are excited to analyze and write about, begin by writing a body paragraph that analyzes the idea from that article and makes a connection to your argument. And then you can move back to your introduction later when you feel more ready to write about your introduction. I do suggest always having at least your thesis statement in mind so that your body paragraphs make sense. But again, you don't need to write everything chronologically. Personally, I jump around all the time. I might be in body paragraph one at one point, then I'll move back to the introduction, down to the conclusion, back to body paragraph four. It doesn't need to be chronological. Just start by getting your ideas dumped on the paper and organizing them later. Once you've written down a rough draft, you then want to read it over and revise to improve the content and organization. So, after you've written your rough draft, ask yourself how you might improve on what you have. Are you citing the correct amount of sources required for your paper? Does the flow of your ideas make sense? Is your thesis statement clear? Um, all of those questions are things you might want to ask as you revise. It's also recommended, sorry for the typo, read commended, should be recommended, to ask for feedback from someone else. So that could be an instructor, a peer, or a tutor. Your instructor might require multiple drafts, so be sure to review their feedback if they give you feedback. You might have peer review, and that's always helpful to hear from your classmates because they are studying the same information as you, especially if your research paper is on the same topic for everyone. Or you can seek tutoring. So, going to the Writing Support Center, our tutors help with all stages of the writing process. So, that's another resource you should take advantage of. It's really important to get a second opinion on your draft, as it helps you see things that you might not have caught on your own. Finally, when you are doing your last reading of your essay before you turn it in, you want to edit for grammar, sentence structure, and word choice then, not before. Remember, content is always more important than grammar. So work on grammar, sentence structure, and word choice after you finalize your content. So, step five, the final step is to document your sources. Um, as one tip I have is to keep track of your source material. So, whenever you copy and paste any quoted material into your paper, make sure you are putting those quotation marks in and you're providing that in-text citation. The in-text citation includes a parenthetical citation, which goes at the end of your quote. That's really helpful for you so that you understand where you got the quote from along with the page number. So I put an example of a parenthetical citation here, but again, that goes at the end of the sentence. This is in regards to MLA format. It's different for APA. You also want to list your sources on the last page of your paper. And now I see this often. Students forget to provide the MLA works cited page, even though they're doing in-text citations. It's really important that you provide that works cited page, especially for a research paper, because you are doing a lot of research and you're providing multiple sources. So it's really important that your reader knows where that information is coming from, along with what type of what type of source that information is coming from. So, is it an article? Is it a peer-reviewed journal? Is it a book? What is it where you're getting that information? And the only way your reader will know is if you have a works cited page or a references page in this case of APA. So always remember you need to add that works cited page at the end of any paper, especially a research paper where you're citing other authors. I do want to show you how you can get information regarding works cited pages because it might be confusing. You might not know, like, I don't know what kind of source this is, and I don't know how to cite it appropriately. So, as I mentioned before, Purdue OWL is an excellent resource for understanding how to cite your sources. I'm going to show you quickly how to find that. So you want to look up Purdue OWL. You can look it up in Google. I have Google Chrome, so you can automatically search things that way. But you can go to Purdue OWL, and it will pop up on Google as OWL Purdue Writing Lab. So once you're here, you want to click on the Purdue Online Writing Lab. And for research, you would go to, and citations, you would go to research and citation. And then you would go to MLA style if that's what you're using. This would be, there's a lot here. So I would recommend starting with the MLA formatting and style guide. And here you will find how to cite based on the 8th edition of MLA. So it starts by giving you the core elements that you need for a citation. And it explains each of the different parts of the citation. So if you're interested in that, you can go ahead and look through this. But what's really great about MLA is it tells you what you need for the works cited page. So for example, you're probably going to be using electronic sources, especially because we're fully online right now. So if you click on electronic sources, you will be able to find the citation style you need depending on the source you're citing. So if you're citing an article in an online scholarly journal, which is likely if you're using the library databases to do so, like EBSCOhost, you can easily find something that you can use, a format you can use. So this one gives you the format in the case of an example. But here you'll see the author name, the title of the article, the journal that the article came from, the volume number, the issue number, the date it was published, in this case, the year it was published, and the link along when you accessed it. So access date is whenever you opened that article. So this is very helpful. Like I said, if you are doing a works cited page, which you must if you're doing a research paper, you can find information on both MLA and APA here. And again, there's also a sample works cited page. So you can check this out as well if you're unsure of how to format your works cited page. And again, that's the last page of your paper. So at the end of any paper where you're citing research, always make sure it's the last page of your paper. Oh, let me see. All right, so the next activity we're going to do is an activity where you document your sources. So now that you've had a chance to do some research, which you perhaps you did some when you were doing the first activity, I want you to practice putting one of your sources in MLA or APA format for your works cited or references page. So depending on what is required for your research paper, you might have to do works cited page for MLA, a references page for APA. On your worksheet, you will need to identify the type of source. So as I was showing you on the OWL Purdue website, I showed you the citation style for an article in a scholarly journal. Just specify which citation style you're using. So are you citing an article in a scholarly journal? Are you citing an ebook? Are you citing a page on a website? So just let your instructor know which type of source you're citing. You will then need to provide a properly formatted citation based on the format provided on the OWL Purdue website. Now, like I said, I suggested OWL Purdue, but if you have a handbook you use, perhaps you purchased the Writer's Resource Guide, or you're using a different resource that your professor recommended, you can use that instead. You don't need to use Purdue OWL's resources, but what's important is that you're just properly formatting the citation you need. or that you're providing on the worksheet. So go ahead and do that. Pause here and continue once you're done. All right, so that's the end of this presentation. I did want to give you a few sources that I used to create this presentation, but they will also be helpful for you as you write your research paper. The first is the PCC Shatford Library. As I said, you will find the databases there, but there's also tutorials there as well that you can use. I wanted to show you those tutorials. So if you do have more questions about writing a research paper, you will be able to use these resources to help you do so. So if you go back to the Pasadena website, the Shatford Library, you can click here where it says Research Guides and Tutorials. Once you click here, you will see a lot of different topics. For now, I'm going to choose English. So if you're taking a composition course, English 1A, you would click here. After that, you would click on English Research Guide, and here you will get a full guide on how to help you different things that might help you as you write. So there's video tutorials, which I found especially helpful. Again, there's a research topic in keyword brainstorming that you just viewed, but there are a lot of different other short videos that you can watch, like tips for evaluating sources, source evaluation, putting the criteria to use, database basics, scale ebooks, another database you can use, but all sorts of great tools that and tutorials that will help you as you do your research. So please check this out once you get a chance. I will put the link in the chat, but the library is a great resource that you should certainly not sleep on. Definitely check it out. The other one is Purdue Owl. As I said already, Purdue Owl is a great resource for in-depth guides to writing research papers. They have a guide for that, which I will link in the chat, and I have also linked here. And they also have citation guides like I just showed you for MLA and APA. So please check out those sources to help you out as you write your research paper. If you have any questions while you're writing, I highly recommend you come see a tutor at the Writing Support Center, which you can access virtually via Zoom. I wish you all the best as you write your research paper. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to visit us. Thank you.